Well, welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is May 22nd, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's a pleasure to be joined in dialogue by members of the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. To speak, I'd ask participants to use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and I'll call on you in order using your first name. As always, I've suggested 3 themes to focus our discussion, which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. As we exchange thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I would welcome anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So in the final part of Plato's Statesman that we are discussing today, beginning at 294b, the visitor from Elea continues to apply the analogy of weaving to the art of ruling in a social fabric. He adds further analogies, those of steering a ship and a doctor tending to patients, as he begins to address the making of laws and the problems presented to the exercise of good statesmanship by laws that are inflexibly rooted in ancient customs. Plato also used the ship steering analogy in the Republic, and we might imagine the sometimes turbulent affairs of a society to be like an unpredictable body of water, requiring a steady hand on the rudder. As a visitor observes, turbulence and instability in the fabric of society come about from dissimilarities between humans and their actions. In our previous episode, we considered the assertion that the wise statesman seeks the mean of extremes, and today we might examine the effects of both mean and extreme over the course of time. The visitor refers to time repeatedly, and most specifically at 305d. There, he states that kingship exercised correctly must not perform practical tasks, quote, but control those with the capacity to perform them, because it knows when it is the right time to begin and set in motion the most important things in cities, and when it is the wrong time, unquote. Here, the good ruler is presented as the orchestrator in time's flow, and indeed, the analogy of music making is brought into play as the visitor ends the dialogue by addressing the harmonizing of sometimes competing virtues of courage and moderation in the leader. The young visitor in Socrates examines 6 different types of constitutions as imitations of the truth, 2 imitations each for rule by one, by the few, and by the many, to which they add a 7th constitution, which is rule by knowledge. The 6 imitations, the visitor says, arise as compromises that are inevitable over time in societies, and he asks, which of these incorrect constitutions is least difficult to live with, given that they are all difficult, and which the heaviest to bear? He goes on to question democracy, as old Socrates did in the Republic, because the masses cannot attain sufficient expertise and knowledge to guide the affairs of state with wisdom through time. Democracies, he says, sometimes succumb to rulers who are not statesmen but experts in faction, and that as the greatest imitators and magicians, they turn out to be the greatest sophists among sophists. Today, 2,400 years later, we may not have to look too deeply to find such factional agitators and sophists among the leaders of what we call with the single name democracy. Perhaps we really ought to apply a number of different names to the current practice of rule by the people, as the visitor states, because in truth, not all democracies are created equally, nor do all democracies evolve in the same manner. When we read the visitor extolling kingly rule on the condition that it is yoked by law, we might give little attention to that condition and focus more on negative historical precedents, particularly those of kings like Henry VIII, whose rule was not constrained by law and thereby descended into tyranny. Is a single, ideal, selfless, philosophical ruler possible? The visitor asks us twice to consider whether it might come to be that a kingly ruler would not maim and murder, but instead orchestrate the practical work of the office holders, and so set in motion the things that need be at the right time and restrain other things from coming into play at the wrong time. All the while, such an ideal leader would keep both the moderate and the courageous among citizens in harmonious contact. And so we might now ask, is it necessary that history repeat itself? Or, as an alternative, could we imagine a different course of time in which we elevate leaders having knowledge of cause and effect in time to guide us in this most complex of technological times? One statesman whose memory lives through time as a unifier of people, in such stark contrast to the factional dividers who plague us today, is Abraham Lincoln. I'll start by playing a reenactment by actor Jeff Daniels of the famous Gettysburg Address that Lincoln delivered in the midst of the Civil War that divided America for 4 years. Consisting of just 271 words, Lincoln's speech in 1863 was both succinct and poignant, as it recalled the purpose of human equality for which America had been founded 77 years earlier, and called on future generations to honor the debt of so much blood shed in the battle for justice among people. Lincoln knew that memories are short, but as he stated, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Memory is essential to the navigation of time, and as Plato repeatedly wrote, all knowledge is recollection. History will forever recall that it was Lincoln, the emancipator, who ended the brutal practice of slavery. Can we see in Lincoln some of the features of the ideal statesman that the visitor from Elea describes? Is Lincoln a prime example of a ruler who understood the effects of time, who led a so-called team of rivals, weaving together their courage and temperance, and who knew the right time to begin and set in motion the most important of things? And what has become now of Lincoln's ideal of government of the people, by the people, for the people? Is it perishing from this earth? And what are we to do about that?
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Well, there was a situation where there was a great complexity in life. I guess the United States had been in existence for the better part of 100 years. And the complexity had broken down into incredible bloodshed and war, a great cost of life. And there in the middle of it, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech where he didn't try to divide people, he tried to bring people together. And he was acting as this kind of maybe the weaver in the analogy of the visitor from Elea, trying to bring the people who had participated in that battle or who had witnessed the battles together in a way that they could look forward into the future. And you know, he really called on our sense of time, or the sense of time of people at that time, to reflect back on the reasons for which this nation had been created, and then also to reflect into the future and to imagine that the great loss of life that had occurred should not be forgotten, and that the reasons for their coming together in the first place would be honored. And so continuing this idea that statesmen really have a sense of time and really have a sense of the right time, as the visitor from Elea says, to bring certain things into motion. And when is the wrong time to bring things into motion? And I'm wondering what we think about that speech of Lincoln's. I mean, it's very famous, of course, and it's held to be one of the most compelling and short speeches of all time. Steve, your thoughts?
Good morning.
Morning.
I look at it, I think the way you characterized it is the idolization version. If you look at it analytically, the founding fathers, what they created was not actually something where all men were created equal. The reason there was a civil war was because they didn't address the issue of slavery. And they just put it on the back burner because they wanted to, it was practical politics in order to create a country that was independent of England. They couldn't do that without the Southern plantation owners. So what they were facing at that time in the Civil War was a result of the expansion of the United States and the new states not being slave states. And the South knew that eventually they'd be overruled and that slavery would be overruled. So it wasn't that the North was rising up for a great cause. They were forced into doing it in order for their own interest. And you have to also, I think, look at what Lincoln did was at the time as the ruler. He was also the tyrant. As the Romans would do in times of trouble, they would allow for a dictator. So Lincoln used properties of the office that were not strictly bound by the Constitution. For example, he couldn't lose Maryland to the southern states, so he suspended their constitution and did not allow them to vote to join the South. Also, I think you have to look at it in the historical perspective of what political reasons, for whatever political reasons, Lincoln had Andrew Johnson as his vice president, who was a Southerner, so he needed to get some support from the Southerners that were still with the North. And when the unfortunate events of him being shot, Andrew Johnson was in charge. He then, after all those battles and all those people that died there, he relinquished a lot of the rules that had been put in place in the South. And then a few years later, when the political parties were evenly split, they needed to get the Southern votes. They agreed to remove the restrictions on the South after the Civil War, which allowed all the white slaveholder politicians to get in, the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, and another 100 years of segregation in the South. So just giving that analytical point of view, besides the idealized version of his beautiful words, which were poetic and are a great ideal to strive for, but I think we have to look at it clearly.
Thank you. And that perspective is really helpful. And you touched on a number of points that are very relevant, I think, to the discussion that the visitor from Elea raises in this section, or in this final section of the Statesman. In particular, the idea that constitutions can be fixed in time, or the problems that come about when constitutions are fixed in time. And as you said, when America was founded, there were a lot of things that were not yet resolved. And the war arose in an attempt to resolve those, I guess, each side thinking that it could resolve it in their way. And things didn't wind up being resolved. And so there is a constitution now that was put in place in the 18th century, but there are still some significant issues that are not resolved. One of which we could maybe even talk about today, which is the current discussion about abortion rights and the apparent impending overturning of the Roe v. Wade decision that was made, I guess, about 50 years ago, for reasons that tie back to the rights that were, quote, deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition. That's the reason that was used in the leaked Supreme Court decision that's apparently pending. And so the question is, how do we deal with changes over time? And in the first 7 years of America's history, there were changes, and that led to this great battle. And what is the place of the leader in this? So you mentioned the word tyrant in relation to Lincoln, and tyranny comes about in today's reading. And I'm wondering if Lincoln, in his unilateral measure, as you mentioned, the suspending of Maryland's constitution, I think there was a number of other moves that were made in Congress to kind of circumvent what would be normal discussion. Does that really constitute tyranny in that case? Or was Lincoln still subject to laws? And with his cabinet, his team of rivals, as they called it, were there controls in place to keep him from becoming a tyrant? So there's a number of things that you really touched upon that I think relate very much to today's discussion. The other thing that you started off with was the word idealization, or idealized version of the United States as being, all men are created equal, presumably meaning women as well. And maybe this brings us back to what Plato wrote in the Republic, the idea of the noble lie. And when countries are created, should there be a noble lie put in place, or a noble story put in place about the nature of the country, even though it's not all people are equal? It wasn't then, and it still isn't now. But is there any value to this sort of thing? Not that Plato was espousing that in the Republic. I think we covered that fairly well, that was not what was being sold as the best way forward. But do we fall into this trap periodically where we think that these stories will persist through time and then they start to fray over time? So you raised a number of really important points, and thank you for that. And let's discuss those. Let's discuss those, because it's very important to understand what the visitor from Elea is saying with respect to constitutions, and is it necessary to write laws down? So, and there's a section I'll just read momentarily. We'll take Darren first, and I thought I would read 294B to D. Darren, your thoughts?
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So it's interesting that you mentioned you want to read that passage, because I was just looking there. I was just gonna say something about maybe not exactly what you were gonna bring up, but I guess I'll just lay my own thoughts out, because there's so many interesting points that have been brought up already that could be discussed or could be pursued. I find the discussion about law in this final section of the text to be really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of things that are interesting, like the role of law and what its place is in governing. And it turns out to have a surprising perspective on it, I think. But okay, just coming back though to the speech and what was discussed earlier, I think one of the ironic things maybe is that Plato in this text actually doesn't forbid slavery per se. At a certain point, he actually ends up sounding quite, I thought, like really severe. I couldn't find the section, but it's definitely in today's reading that he's talking about how the statesman, one of the ways he weaves the people together is through education and choosing the right kind of education for the right characters. So you need good teachers for different kinds of characters. And then the people you can't educate who don't have the right nature and also who aren't malleable to education, then, they deserve the worst punishments and even slavery. So I was like, okay, well, Plato just got really severe all of a sudden. But I think at least the translation I read, Plato presents it as a question. And then the younger Socrates says like, perhaps, or something like that. So, I mean, this is always a catch with reading Plato's dialogues, right? Like what is actually Plato's view, or what is Plato actually just presenting or provoking us to think about? I think one of the important things, I mean, I guess we'll get to some of the nitty gritty and the details later, but like one of the things I like about this section is that it challenges us not to reify the laws or laws in general as if they're set in stone and all we can do is like follow the law, and following the law is like the highest good you can possibly do, and there's so much that where Plato just sort of wants to like poke holes in that, like psychologically for the reader, I feel like. So one of the things was at 299b, he's clearly had Socrates in mind in the background. So he describes how ridiculous it would be if like he's comparing statesmanship to seafaring and medicine here. And he says, wouldn't it be ridiculous if there is a law that if anyone is found to be investigating the law of pilotage or navigation or the subject of health and true medical doctrine about winds and things hot and cold, contrary to the written rules, or to be indulging in any speculation whatsoever on such matters, he shall in the first place not be called a physician or a ship captain, but a stargazer, a kind of loquacious sophist. And secondly, anyone who is properly qualified may bring an accusation against him and hale him into court for corrupting the young and persuading them to attack the arts of navigation and medicine in opposition to the laws, and to govern the ships and the sick according to their own will.
That's in the section where they're talking about the rule by the many, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the problem that the many would have in actually understanding the skills that are involved or the skills that are necessary. So that use of the ship steering analogy, how is this mass going to steer the ship? Do they have the expertise?
Right. But yeah, and then so there's this long stretch of dialogue is about various ways of looking at that, and the quality that's brought out in this particular line that I read is about what if they like forbid any speculation or like the indulgence in any speculation. And as he says, like just further down from what I read, like nothing they say ought to be wiser than the laws, for no one is ignorant of medicine and the laws of health or of the pilot's art and navigation, since anyone who pleases can learn the existing written rules and ancestral customs. And then later down, younger Socrates responds, clearly all the arts would be utterly ruined, nor could they ever rise again through the operation of the law prohibiting investigation. And so life, which is hard enough now, would then become absolutely unbearable.
I found that section that you were reading at 299b, where I've got in notes, the point that particularly struck me, right, I think at the beginning of 299b, is he says, or young Socrates says, well, anyone who willingly and voluntarily undertakes to hold office under such conditions would fully deserve to suffer any penalty whatever and pay back any amount. It's one thing to be in power, but then another thing to face the consequences of power. And if you're not exercising the power with expertise, then you will also face potentially some serious consequences when the ship of state hits the rocks.
I sort of actually understood that as a kind of joke. Like, who would be crazy if anyone's crazy enough to take this job, given these conditions on it, that one being forbidding speculation, but then there's other things that, you're being judged by the masses, by democratically about whether the ship was steered right or not, rather than, by knowledge, which is the contrast here. The person would just have to be ridiculous to begin with to actually take up this job, given these conditions, that's these hypothetical conditions being laid out here.
It's maybe, one of the problems that we have today now is that given the unending focus that goes on our leaders, every word they say is broadcast all over the internet. There's people twisting the words that they say. Who would really want to expose themselves to that now, except for somebody perhaps who has something to gain by being in office, something for personal gain? And that's maybe that's what he's calling into question. 2,400 years ago, what are we seeing? That question that I asked at the end of Lincoln's speech, what are we seeing with respect to government of the people, for the people, by the people now? Is it really turning out? Is that ideal? To use Steve's words, is that ideal actually playing out as Lincoln might have hoped, or are there things that are really frustrating it?
Yeah, that's a great connection. So I brought that stuff about forbidding speculation up, and how even the young Socrates responds that would be terrible, because then the arts would be utterly ruined, nor could they arise again through the operation of the law prohibiting investigation. So I wanted to tie this back to like the slavery issue that I raised earlier, because although Plato seems to suggest in a section that the people who can't be educated, well, they should be punished really severely and don't have any rights, he says, and some of them should be enslaved. But there's also another thrust in this dialogue, and that's what it is, right? It's not like a statement about what should be. This is just a conversation between these two people. And another aspect of that is that it seems to me that Plato, in challenging our reification of the laws, and it seems to be inviting imagination and speculation regarding the laws that we have, he's actually inviting us to challenge and maybe rethink our practices and customs. And I think maybe one of the reasons Plato seems to couch all the that idea in seems to sort of bury it in a dialogue. Maybe it's kind of dangerous to suggest things like that. I mean, many great philosophers, not just Plato, have sort of encountered political issues and expressing their views and political dangers in doing so. But although, he might sound really severe in allowing slavery and all that, for us today, one of the things that's valuable about this section is that he's also telling us not to reify the laws and inviting investigation about them and thinking about them.
For sure. And let me just, I'll focus on that 294B to D section. You mentioned Plato inviting slavery or maybe condoning it under certain circumstances. If you could put that section in the chat, I want to just find that and refer to it specifically. But there's one thing that I wanted to call into light is the statement at around 297C, where the visitor says it's no small, they're talking about a particular issue. The visitor says it's no small matter if one stirs up this subject and then proceeds to leave it where it is instead of going through it and showing the mistake that now occurs in relation to it. And I think this is one thing with Plato where sometimes people think that he is arriving at a conclusion about something, but they're not necessarily following all of the logic that's led to that conclusion. And his logic can be extremely dense sometimes. And that's, one of the things I found when we talked about the Republic is that there are these persisting misapprehensions about the Republic. And I think it's because the entire train of logic is easy to lose. There's just so many pieces to it, it's easy to lose. And so one might look at the myth of people being born of metals, for example, in the Republic, and bronze, silver, and gold, and think that that's what Plato is saying about people, is that they're just fated to have those characteristics, when in fact he goes on and then there's that allegory of the cave near the end of the Republic, which is really saying something different. So I just wanted to call that into light, this idea that we need to get through that train of logic to understand what's being said. But to relate a number of the things that you brought up in that section from 299, I just wanted to go briefly over 294B to D. So this is about the complexity of human affairs and these differences that are always between people. So in here, let me just do a screen share and I'll just read it. So the visitor says, now in a certain sense, it is clear that the art of the legislator belongs to that of the king. But the best thing is not that the law should prevail, but rather the kingly man who possesses wisdom. So wisdom is the key there. Do you know why? Young Socrates says, what then is the reason? The visitor says, that law could never accurately embrace what is best and most just for all at the same time, and so prescribe what is best. For the dissimilarities between human beings and their actions, and the fact that practically nothing in human affairs ever remains stable, prevent any sort of expertise whatever from making any simple decision in any sphere that covers all cases and will last for all time. But we see law bending itself more or less towards this very thing. It resembles some self-willed and ignorant person who allows no one to do anything contrary to what he orders, nor to ask any questions about it, not even if, after all, something new turns out for someone which is better, contrary to the prescription which he himself has laid down. Young Socrates says, true, the law does absolutely as you have just said with regard to each and every one of us. The visitor says, then it is impossible for what is perpetually simple, he's talking about the law, to be useful in relation to what is never simple, in other words, human affairs. Young Socrates says, very likely. The visitor says, why then is it ever necessary to make laws, given that law is not something completely correct? We must find the cause of this. And so there we have a questioning, as you said, the purpose of the laws. And I don't think this is not the final view. The visitor isn't saying that there should never be laws, but he says we must investigate the cause of this. Steve, your thoughts on that?
I think on your point and what Darren said, first off, I think we have to look at Plato in perspective. When slavery was just a part of life for everybody, slavery didn't start in the United States. It was part of Greek, all ancient civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, everybody. So that's, he's not being extreme. He's talking about the views of the elite, which he was part of at the time, which was pretty much the view of everybody at that time in society. But I think the point about the laws, there's two ways. There's one, you have the laws can be, set in stone based on ancient traditions, and sometimes need to be changed. They also have to be aware of unscrupulous people that are, the unscrupulous medical doctor, I think, as he talks about. You have to have laws to protect the people against these unscrupulous people, but you have to also make the law changeable. But I think, like in the case of the United States Constitution, it's difficult to change. So there has to be some way of going forward in the middle way.
And it's a good point. I think a lot of countries have problems changing their constitution. here in Canada, for example, the Constitution, well, there wasn't a written Constitution to start off with in 1867 when Canada was formed, but it was changed in 1982. But there was a compromise made at that point where certain provinces couldn't agree that 1982 version should apply for all time. So they instituted what is called a notwithstanding clause, which gives a province a right to override one of the provisions in the Constitution using this notwithstanding clause. So this was a compromise that was made in 1982 when the Canadian Constitution was finally written and adopted. But it's an interesting question with respect to the relation of laws to time, and the statement that the visitor is saying that the statesman must know when is the right time to put certain things in motion and when is not the right time to put things in motion, or when things must be constrained. And this whole connection to time and how it is reflected in the laws. Can you write a law that applies for all time? And in that passage that I just read, there's several references to time and the fact that laws can't be, it says any simple decision in any sphere that covers all cases and will last for all time. That's being what's called into question there. And so with respect to the US Constitution, for example, as I mentioned, the leaked pending decision on abortion rights, one of the reasons that is being used to overturn the decision that was made, roughly 50 years ago, and I'm quoting, this is what I got from the leaked decision as it was published in the Washington Post. It says, any such right must be deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition. And so that's going back, some 250 years. But the fabric of society has changed a lot since then. And how do we account for the fact that a relatively small nation at that point has since expanded significantly? The population is not all from primarily England and a few centers in Europe. The population is from all over the world now, and all sorts of different ideas have come into play. And then the practice of abortion itself has changed significantly. There wasn't safe abortion back then. There is now. And so how does a law that was written that long ago, how does it persist and hold through time? Do we constantly go back to these laws and we say, well, we can't resolve these issues among ourselves now, so we'll just revert to the old law as it was, and we'll revert to these old customs, and we'll never be able to change things. So I think it's a really difficult thing that the visitor is discussing here, that really is something that I think reflects a lot in our world today. As you said, how do we protect ourselves from unscrupulous people without laws? And that's the problem all the time. I mean, people are people, and there are a lot of people who will do selfish things at the expense of others. And one person's liberty could be another person's enslavement, I guess. And so that's the constant challenge. So how do we deal with the problem of laws that just become stuck in time when time moves on constantly? And what do we think of the idea that the statesman is somebody who knows when things in time are shifting, and how we affect those changes, and how we get people's agreement? Steve, you mentioned that it's difficult to amend a constitution now. How do we get people's agreement on these things, that things have changed and it's time to change the rules? Darren, your thoughts?
Hi. So it seems like Plato thinks that in order to do the best good, that it seems like he thinks that if there was a wise ruler, that they would just be able to act very particularly regarding each person, each circumstance. So maybe we're going back to the myth that was in the first section of the dialogue about the was it the divine king or whatever, the divine ruler, who was able to take care of each, always has a hand on everything. But as we see, like, that's clearly not possible. And so we do need laws. So I'm just putting my own thoughts together about what I think Plato is saying here, just in response to your question. Based off, as we saw in the passage you read, the stranger says that the law is a very crude instrument, and it's a very simple device for a reality that's never simple. And so it seems like then they do pose a question, and like, why do we need laws? Like, what are they good for? So at a certain point in the dialogue, and I'm glad you warned us, James, about how complex these dialogues are, because there's so many different moments, and they move back, and sometimes I lose track of like which form they're talking about, or like what exactly they're responding to, what proposition they're responding to, because they just explore so many possibilities here. But at a certain point, like we get this sort of opposition between, we can have this wise and kingly ruler who has knowledge and take care of everything in its particularities, and then we have laws. So the laws seem pretty bad at that point, compared to what that ruler could do. So so Plato does pose this question, why we need laws. And just I guess a long story short, my reading then is that what Plato then comes around to, and this comes back to what I said earlier, that although we need laws because we live in an earthly world, not a world where there is an omniscient ruler who can take care of everything in its particulars and always knows exactly what is good in each situation. And so the attitude, I think Plato's suggesting the attitude we should take is that although we need laws, that we should have a kind of loose attitude towards them. We shouldn't, as I said earlier, reify them or treat them as objects set in stone. And the laws, by the way, I think he also includes ancestral customs or unwritten laws, as he says at certain points. And so we need laws, but there's always the danger of treating them as almost divine objects ruling over us, rather than things that we can change in order to achieve a good society or justice. Maybe just a passage I'll bring up is 301e. He says, as the case now stands, since, as we claim, no king is produced in our states who is, like the ruler of the bees in their hives, by birth preeminently fitted from the beginning in body and mind, we are obliged, as it seems, to follow in the track of the perfect and true form of government by coming together and making written laws. So, and then there's this whole discussion about what is second best versus the first best, I guess. But I'll just stop there though.
And that's a key point, right? That there is no divine being naturally born, and then so how do you govern things when there's going to be mistakes? And I think that B reference was, I think that was a really good one that you called to light there. So I was going to say as well that, even someone who gives a law during their lifetime, and the visitor uses this in the passage that goes from 295a to 296a, he uses the example of a doctor who writes a prescription, and the patient takes the prescription, the doctor goes away, patient takes the prescription, the doctor comes back earlier than expected and finds out that the medicine didn't work as expected. And this happens all the time, right? There's no perfect cure for things, or rarely is there a perfect cure for things. And so things need to be adjusted. So if the doctor comes back earlier than expected, is the doctor supposed to stick to his original prescription and say to the patient, well, even though it didn't turn out as expected, I gave you this prescription a month ago and I'm back here earlier than I expected, and you have to stick to that prescription? Or is the doctor allowed to change the prescription when he arrives back earlier than expected? And so I think that was an interesting analogy that Plato gave there in terms of the doctoring and administering to the patient. And I guess just to think about Lincoln's words about the government of the people, for the people, by the people. If we are to be governed by these laws that are set down hundreds of years ago, is it really government of the people, for the people, by the people, if it's constrained by these ancient laws? Is it really free government at that point? Maybe that's a point that we could discuss. It just occurred to me that maybe that sort of thing kind of goes contrary to that ideal that Lincoln set out. And, we tend to hold this ideal that government of the people, for the people, by the people is the best type of government going. And we call it democracy by one name, but it seems to be turning into a number of different things. And so maybe there's some confusion there. So thank you for those points. We'll go to JK and then to Steve.
Yeah, I think it sounds like Plato is, giving us these little puzzles, about to figure out, what is the best government, and how do you find a statesman that's going to be able to rule fairly. And so you need laws to also constrain, someone who you think is the right person for that job, but who is not. And so you need laws to prevent someone who might, corrupt the system and do everything for his own selfish gain. So there is no easy answer. There are we need laws, but at the same time, those laws are fallible, and they should be amended when necessary, and so forth. And look at the law. Look at the Second Amendment, right? we have all these problems with people, shooting people with guns, and we can't do anything about it because the law is it's established in the Constitution. But nobody, it's not enough people are willing to do something about that, to make the changes. So, it's really a difficult problem. So even the people, the wise few who made up these laws were also fallible, right? And so you can't, and so that accounts for why there are certain amendments that need to be made to at least keep up with the times, with the changes and so forth. And now we have a political, these political forces that are taking us back, to what the original laws were not there to protect certain groups and so forth. And those are oversights that people didn't do enough to establish those certain, women's rights to make their own decisions about themselves. And so, so it is a kind of a, I think he's Plato's just posing, all these problems with how to, run a society. How do you have a harmonious society if you don't have the right person to enforce the laws or to make the decisions necessary to satisfy everybody's needs and rights and so forth. At the same time, you can't just have ironclad laws. The laws have to also keep up with the times. So it's a difficult quite question, because there are shortcomings in having laws, and there are shortcomings in finding the right person to steer the ship, right, and so forth. So it's a back and forth. Yeah.
Very much so. I mean, that ship steering analogy too, where the, again, the visitor says, well, if the captain were to write down the rules in advance, and then all of a sudden they find themselves, for example, in a storm, and, the captain is then unable to change the rules, maybe the captain didn't foresee that there would be a wave of, such and such a height. And, the rules that he wrote down earlier prescribed that they would do such a thing. Well, it turns out that's thing that he wrote down earlier wouldn't allow the ship to survive. And so is the captain to be bound by rules that he himself wrote down earlier for circumstances that could not be foreseen. And you raise the point about the Second Amendment, again, the US Constitution, Second Amendment. And my understanding of that is that it was written with a mind to the militia. I think the original wording said that the militia should be allowed to arm themselves. And then I think sometime later there was a Supreme Court decision that expanded that meaning to all people. And really, I think there is a very good debate that Plato brings up, is that what do we understand the words to mean, and how do we interpret that? So the interpretation of the words changes over time. There really isn't a need for militias now like there was 300 years ago when these ideas were around. And so do we naturally expand that meaning to include everybody now that militias are no longer a normal course of events? And what do we understand by the meaning? Or, when the principle is laid down that there is a right to life, liberty, and happiness, what do we understand in particular by the word liberty, and in particular by the word happiness? Especially when someone's liberty can impede on somebody else's liberty. For example, if someone has a right to have a gun, does that mean that people should be subject to the abuse of that gun? As happened in Buffalo, was it 2 weeks ago, a week ago, that horrible shooting where 10 people died because some 18-year-old boy had a right to go out and buy a gun. And so that infringed on the life, liberty, and happiness of 10 people who are now dead. I'm not judging whether these interpretations are right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is what happens when these rules are written down and set in stone for all of time. And somehow there needs to be a mechanism by which there can be rational discussion and adjustment of these rules and principles as circumstances change. So thank you for raising that particular example. We'll go to Steve and then to Jose.
Thank you. On the point you just made, I'm a firm believer that the United States needs to reform its gun laws. But if you say that the laxity of the laws is the cause, and you look at what that person was a copycat of somebody in New Zealand who has very stringent gun laws that was a racist, and he was motivated by racial feelings, and I believe he killed 30-some people. So I think that's, the cause is rooted into a lot of the discussion with the Civil War and rights. And I'd just like to quickly relate back to a point you made earlier about the Canadian Constitution and the notwithstanding clause, which is really what the Civil War is about. The southern states believed they had a right to secede, and the northern states, said our laws don't allow that. So that it came to the point where there was a battle about it. But still, in Plato, in 300C to 301D, he talks about the aristocrats, the oligarchy, and the people, the democracy, not be able to put up with a monarch or a tyrant. So, where's the divide? Where does the good ruler, he can be influenced more by the people with the money, the oligarchs, the aristocrats, than the people as a whole. It's saying that they're going to listen to groups, trades groups of the workers and everything, but it comes down to who has the power. It's the realization in society that the people with the money also have the power, and they can corrupt the rule of law, so that you do need to have laws that are, all you can base it on is your past history to be somewhat stringent. They should be changeable, and it's the same. But what you also see now in the separation of states' rights compared to the Constitution, that all of the red states in the United States are preparing to put in very stringent anti-abortion legislation as soon as the ruling comes down. So that's a case of them changing the laws for what many would see as a bad policy, but they see it as a good policy. So that's I think the conflict that Plato was addressing.
Good points, and certainly, I mean, J.K. I think alluded to the fact that lawmakers are fallible. And which one of us is perfect? If anybody tells me they're perfect, including myself, I'd say that they're a liar. So we all make mistakes, and there has to be some mechanism, as you said, Steve. Where is the divide? How do we make that compromise and understand that we each need to forgive each other a little bit for our trespasses and errors, and how do we what's the mechanism there? So thank you for that. Jose.
Yes, I think from what I have learned from my own experience with the law, not because I'm a convict of any kind, but during my divorce, I learned quite a bit on how the laws, at least in Canada, work in general, the principles of jurisprudence, and why is it that we don't have a law for everything. And I did understand at least their position, and I think I do understand what the problem is as well in the US. And I will come at the end, take this as a little bit of an argument, and at the end, what I believe is something that could help. When you think about the judges, when they appoint the judges, there is the law by the lawmakers, and there is the administration of the law. And I think most of the issue is not in the creation of the law. Most of the issue, as I will relate in a moment, is with the administration of the law. And why is that? When you watch the hearings for the judges, the Supreme Court judges, typical answer is, no, I follow the law. I don't let my ideology or my beliefs or my religious this or my whatever beliefs I have, I follow the law, which probably is a good intention, and is mostly done with the existing law, because the existing law cannot be applied directly. It always goes back to jurisprudence. And the reason for that is because there's no such a thing as a perfect law. And I learned that as well. So why is it we don't have a fixed law about divorce separation? It's because there are hundreds of thousands of different cases. So that's why the judges exist, to administer and to adjudicate based on law and based on jurisprudence. Now, this is what happens. I tend to give the judges the benefit of the doubt that their ideology and beliefs don't get in the way of applying the law. Okay, let's assume that is the case. However, though, they do come into place when they need to change, not change the law, but to set a precedent. And as you know, jurisprudence is based on new precedents of an old law. So then I remember this movie about Ruth Ginsburg, the Supreme Court judge who died last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago. There's a moment where she's arguing for a change. Again, on the basis of sex was the title of the movie. And the three conservative judges basically said to her, are you asking us to change 100 years of precedent? And she says, yeah. If you're going to go, and then she presents a good argument. I don't remember the argument, but she basically says, if you're going to live like that, like, and that is impossible to change precedent, they might as well forget about all this. The countries will never change, societies will change, and the laws will never change. And that is when I see the influence of the ideological posture of the judges, when they have to make a change, not to administrate the law, but when they have to set a new precedent. So my view in all this is a little crazy, right? But I think that if anyone needs to be elected, and I believe that I'm a little bit on the Plato side, that I don't believe that much in the deep representative democracy, because actually it doesn't represent, and people are very convinced by a good populist leader. I've seen it in Peru, the country where I grew up recently. Didn't grow up recently. I saw the election recently. And a populist leader can convince people of something that will never get done. And anyway, so my suggestion is that the judges are the ones that need to be elected by the people. That way, they would represent a composition of the demographics. And the reality is that when it comes to set precedent, ideological basis will kick in. I mean, no question. See the movie about Ruth Ginsburg, and you will see that at one point the need for change coming from the changing society needs to be represented by the judges. But if the judges are selected by what I call a minority, because it is the party in power, to me that's a minority, then we'll continue to have this issues of setting no new precedents and overturn any new precedents that didn't conform with 100-year history, to put it that way.
Those are really great points. Thank you. And that example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, overturning 100-year precedents, very powerful. And I just actually, I noticed Vincent put into the chat window a comment about trial by jury. And Vincent is saying that trial by jury was put into the Constitution as a way of helping to prevent the rising of a tyranny, so that the people at that level of administering the law, as you said, Jose, people have some say in that process. And this, I think, is part of this complex logic that Plato is bringing us. He says a couple of things. He says that the leader should not be above the law. So even a king should be yoked by the law, not above the law. Like Henry VIII was above the law, could just change the law. Like he just completely reformed everything just because he wanted a divorce. And so certainly no one should be above the law. But I think there's an important point that's made actually that in near the end of the dialogue, where generalship, judges, and rhetoricians are held to be, and this is in 303E to 304A, are held to be the subordinates of the ruler, but very key subordinates, and they have to be carefully chosen. And so, as you question, are they chosen by the people? But how are they chosen? It's certainly not chosen by somebody who is going to become a tyrant. I think that would be, absolutely the wrong way of doing it, as you said. So, yeah, you raised that key point. And then the point about jurisprudence that you were talking about, having this continuity of logic. I mean, that's the way I'm seeing what you were saying. That there should be, at least if a precedent is established, if we're going to change it, then let's understand what Plato might call the account of the reasons why. If something has come to be, let's understand why it's come to be, the reasons why, and let's then understand if we need to change it. So what account of the reasons do we give for changing something? And when I say the account of the reasons why, this is what Socrates called knowledge in the Meno. And the account of the reasons why comes about over time. It's not something that you get in an instant. It's something that you get by understanding the causes and effects over time. And so this is something that I think he's clearly saying about the ruler here, is that the good ruler, the good statesman, understands the effects of time on things. And this is something that I think he's saying that the masses can't understand the effects of time on things because each one has their own motivations. So I think there's a number of important points that you raised there that really tie into this dialogue very well. So thank you. And we'll go to JK.
Well, if everything is if laws are fallible and the ruler, whoever it becomes a ruler, we think that he's the right person. That's fallible, right? I mean, who's to determine he's the right person to lead, right? He's going to be fair and so forth. So, what's left, is really just some form of democracy where the majority at least decides, can put, can voice and decide who should lead, right? And so it's hard to buy this argument that democracy is so bad and it's the worst of all the other forms of government, oligarchy and aristocracy and so forth. And so like in this country, we're supposed to have a democracy, but it's not a real democracy because instead of majority rule, it's 24% of the population. It's 24% because of the electoral college. Certain states do not, certain states with the least populations have the same power as the states with the most population. So that's the imbalance there. And so when we have leaders, the leaders are not chosen by the majority of people, they're chosen by 24%, which is quite an imbalance, So we don't really have a true democracy in that sense.
And that's a good point. And kind of echoes what Jose was saying about in a so-called representative democracy, do the elected leaders actually represent? And maybe that's the case when you say that somebody's elected with 24% of the vote, is that really representative? In mechanisms that provide one person's vote to count more than another person's vote, such as the Electoral College in the US, maybe that's another case of diluting representation, or maybe when politicians are allowed to define their own district boundaries, their own constituency boundaries. And then it's said that politicians are choosing their voters and not the other way around. And again, the idea of representation is diluted or even destroyed. So, but it's a point I think that Plato makes a number of times about democracy is that we call it with one name, but maybe there are really a number of different things that it really is. And, oligarchy, aristocracy, those are words that are brought into this dialogue. Effectively rule by the few, the aristocracy being the wealthy, the oligarchy being the wealthy who are unconstrained by laws. And certainly, Plato isn't saying that, I don't think he's saying that democracy is always the worst. I think he's saying that, however, if there were an ideal leader who wasn't selfish and wasn't going to maim and murder and be a tyrant, but actually rule with intelligence and wisdom, then democracy is not your best choice in that circumstance, or at least democracy as it's being defined over the course of history. So I think there's a number of things that get quite complicated in that whole argument. And certainly, if he's seen as being anti-democratic, it doesn't mean that he's, advocating for tyranny or anything of that sort. I think quite the opposite. So there's definitely a number of complex and confusing ideas to bring together.
Right. I'm just saying, what's the chances of you getting the right statesman, right? Through time, and what are the percentages of of time when you have the right statesman. And who's going to choose that person? I mean, how does he prove himself? And does he just choose himself, or is there a small few that choose him to be the one that's going to lead? I mean, what is the mechanism for that? And and historically, it's been the divine right of kings. They're chosen by divinity, and that it runs in, and they continue through generations in the same family and so forth.
Absolutely, yeah. In the divine right of kings, I think that's a good example of how a convenient system, or a system, could be conveniently invented. Of course, was anybody ever appointed by God? What evidence is there of this? But it was quite a convenient reason to use that sustained these kings and often tyrants in power for a long time. And so, yes, how do we come about these rulers? It's interesting. I just wanted to point out at 298A and then again at 301D, something that I talked about in my introduction about the historical precedent. And, certainly these rule by single people have not turned out well in history. I don't know, maybe King Solomon was, a different character, but certainly Henry VIII and some other tyrants like him bring us very bad precedents. And so that leads us to assume that these people are always going to be like that. So at 298A, the visitor says, let's suppose that we all thought of them as doing the most terrible things to us. 301D goes on further to, I'm just looking for the section here. 301D, it is in this way that the tyrant has come about, we say, in a king and oligarchy and democracy, because people have found themselves unable to put up with the idea that single individual of ours as monarch, and refuse to believe that there would ever come to be anyone who deserved to rule in such a way, so as to be willing and able to rule with virtue and expert knowledge, distributing what is just and right correctly to all. They think that a person in such a position always mutilates, kills, and generally maltreats whichever of us he wishes. Although if there were to come to be someone of this sort we are describing, he would be prized and would govern a constitution that would alone be correct in the strict sense, steering it through happiness. In the strict sense, I think was the key word there. So yeah, no, thank you for raising that. I mean, this is the problem. How do we find such an individual in this world? Steve and then Darren.
Going to 305 D to E, for what is really kingship, but not itself performing practical tasks, but control those with capacity to perform them, because it knows when it is the right time to begin and set in motion the most important things in cities and when it is the wrong time. So I think if we can use again the example of Lincoln knowing when it was time to set aside certain rules. And I'd also like to use Henry VIII. I think you're characterizing him as a tyrant, that he became a tyrant just to divorce his wife, but that's a cliche. Henry VIII was a great humanist writer. And what he put in place, what he was questioning was the rule of the Catholic Church at the time. So he's an important figure in the Reformation, and the changes that the Catholic Church were controlled by the clergy and the land-owning aristocrats. So what was coming into place in England and with the Protestant Reformation was the trading class, the nouveau rich, the new rich as it was in Rome, and that there was a questioning of this authoritative rules of the church. And that set in motion so many things that are part of our modern world. The expansion of England was potentially tied to the fact that they had this more free society, and that they were able to include more people and expand it. And if you look at history, that led to the Magna Carta because the nobles had more power and they could rein in the kings at the time from their power. And that also led to, what is, currently the Canada and the United States. So I think that the characterization of Henry VIII should be more towards, he definitely had his bad spots, but so did all kings and rulers of that time, and many a lot worse, But, he was a very important figure in being the enlightened ruler at the right time, and calling into question some of the established laws and ancestral traditions, of the Catholic Church has been ruling for 1400 years to change those to which going forward you can see the line diverging to the modern world.
Thanks, and I appreciate that perspective. And certainly, I was being overly brief when I was characterizing Henry VIII as always a tyrant, because he certainly did have some good qualities. As you mentioned, a writer, he wrote songs, and he did manage to reform things. And I think maybe the reform, as you're saying, turned out well, but I think maybe some of the reasons for it were not the right reasons. So the fact that something turns out maybe for the better, but for the wrong reasons, I don't think necessarily excuses the ruler who does the wrong things at the wrong time.
Why do you think they were the wrong reasons? He was questioning the rules of the church that said a man and a wife that were should be able to get divorced. Mm-hmm. Do you disagree with what he was trying to change? And he ended up taking away a lot of the power, the monasteries and the Catholic Church at the time. So I'd like to hear why you think those were the wrong reasons, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. And I think, it is right to question rules, like why should it not be possible to get a divorce? Another thing, I think, just to go and just do something because you yourself think that that's the right thing to do without the appropriate counsel. And certainly, his one of his key counsels, Thomas More, for example, he put to death because Thomas More refused to take the oath of allegiance to the new church. So these acts where he's murdering and maiming people because of something that he thinks is right is not the way I don't think that the visitor from Elea is describing the ideal ruler. The ideal ruler would do things that thinks with reason and intelligence are the right things to do, but not through means like that. And the good ruler is someone who puts in place the office holders who have both courage and moderation. And the good ruler takes the counsel from those advisors those office holders who have those capacities. And so, when a figure like Thomas More, and there was others, he wasn't the only one who lost his head when Henry got angry. I think that's when you need to take the counsel of people around you and not just say, well, just what I say goes. That's certainly not what the visitor from Elea is advocating here. So I think there were reasons to do as you say. And certainly the church had a great deal of power. The church had accumulated a great deal of land, and so Henry just expropriated all of the monasteries. Now, did he use the proceeds from that expropriation for good purposes, or did he use it to conduct his wars? Again, the debate can go on. So, but it wasn't all bad. It's just a question, I guess, of maybe degrees of what the ruler's intentions are. But you raise some very good points, and it comes back to that debate about where is the line drawn? As you said earlier, where is the divide? So it's a very good point. I don't know what the answer is to that. So thank you for bringing that. And thank you again for highlighting that section 305 D to E, which I've got here on the screen. It's very critical, that understanding when is the right time to begin and set in motion the important things. That's a very key thing. So Darren, your thoughts?
I just want to come back to some of the discussion about like how to choose the right ruler or the best rulers and how they come about. I think that's the problem as it's often posed in these discussions. And as we've already seen, like it seems like the stranger or Plato problematizes that possibility, whether we could ever identify or somehow place the right person in that position. So I just want to read, another passage that I think sheds some more light on Plato's approach to this problem. So this is actually just continues on from passages that Steve and James, yourself, and I read. So we've already seen the passage at 301D, and earlier I read the thing at 301E where, and I think you brought this up too, James, but where where the stranger questions whether we have it's possible to have such a leader or whether we do have such a leader. So I just want to continue from that because I think it's interesting what he says next. So I'll just read this passage. So this is at 301E to 302A now. So can we wonder then, Socrates, at all the evils that arise and are destined to arise in such kinds of government when they are based upon such a foundation, and must conduct their affairs in accordance with written laws and with customs without knowledge? Maybe other people interpret this differently, but I understand it's like as a knowledge that the divine ruler would have regarding individual cases. So we wouldn't need laws. So I think that's the kind of knowledge that's being referred to here. For everyone can see that any other art built upon such a foundation would ruin all its works that are so produced. Ought we not rather to wonder at the stability that inheres in the state? For states have labored under such conditions for countless ages. Nevertheless, some of them are lasting and are not overthrown. Many, to be sure, like ships that founder at sea, are destroyed, have been destroyed, and will be destroyed hereafter, through the worthlessness of their captains and crews, who have the greatest ignorance of the greatest things, men who have no knowledge of statesmanship, but think they have in every respect most perfect knowledge of this above all other sciences. And younger Socrates says, very true. And the stranger says, is it then our duty to see which of these not right forms of government is the least difficult to live with, though all are difficult, and which is the most oppressive, although this is somewhat aside from the subject we had proposed for ourselves? On the whole, however, perhaps all of us have some such motive in mind in all that we are doing. And then younger Socrates says, yes, it is our duty, of course. This is a surprising turn in the dialogue for me, because it's like Plato's like proposing a new way of looking at the problem, which is surprisingly modern. Instead of finding the right person, who embodies, who understands, who has perfect knowledge and has perfect knowledge of the good and also of the world and individual circumstances, which seems impossible, so we just give up. It's like he's changing the problem here into a very modern way. Like, I think it's a very modern way of looking at it. So it seems like all along, like up to now, it seems like, we're never going to have that really perfect form of government where, we don't need laws and it's just a person, where the ideal is like a kind of, it seems like a kind of divine ruler who would know all the particulars and know exactly what to do and what is good in each circumstance, which seems pretty hard to know. But he's posing a different kind of problem now, which is to find like of the not, as he says here, not right forms of government is the least difficult to live with, though all are difficult. And he poses this in almost like political science terms, right? He asks us to like see that, like wonder about how like the fact that some states, despite the fact that no one wanted to claim we have this perfect knowledge yet, some states do persist and maybe do achieve some goods that are proper to a polity. But even though like we wouldn't claim that we have this perfect knowledge, so how did that happen? Like it's almost like him saying. And so we have to try to find like which form, other the ones that are possible for us human beings, like which form is the least difficult and the least oppressive. So instead of like trying to achieve the ultimate good, we just want to find something that's not the most oppressive thing and the most difficult thing to live with. And he's almost suggesting that like we look at our experience of the actually available states, and he says that like we've labored under such ignorance for as he says, countless ages. Nevertheless, some of them are lasting and some are not overthrown. And so, I want to bring this up just to suggest that there might be different ways of posing the problem of political theory and what it is we want in a state. But Plato doesn't dismiss the idea of the most ideal kind of ruler either. That's a sort of ruling that might be possible, I think, as he described it in myth. And I think the myth was there for a reason. Like we could talk about that, but that's a different topic. I think the dialogue is a way of exploring this tension between like different approaches to the problem and ways of looking at things. Like we can try to achieve, and this is not just at the political level, this is at the individual level too. We could try to achieve the perfect ideal. And, at the individual level, we could try to be saints, or, as he refers to various times there, there's also the second best thing. Like if we can't do the most ideal thing, it doesn't mean like everything is up for grabs and we could just be immoral. It means like, well, maybe there's another lower level. If we can't or won't do the most ideal thing, if we think that's out of reach, maybe there's more a human level thing that maybe we use the word humane too. I don't know. But so I think some of the complexity of this dialogue comes from, and, they're going back and forth and like, what does Plato not like? Plato doesn't like laws. because he thinks we should have this divine ruler. But oh wait, then he says we need laws again. And it's like, okay, do we need laws or not? And he ends up with this very complicated, unstable view on laws, it seems. But I think that's just part of what I see, at least what I see going on here. And just from, this is just a thought provoked by some of the previous discussion, that there's just like exploration of the two approaches, and which do we take? Well, as these dialogues often go, like Plato does sort of leave an open question. And like, I think he wants us to keep thinking, like maybe in the end, that's the most important thing, like whether it's about the laws or what the good is to keep thinking.
Well said. Yeah. I mean, certainly that's the modus operandi of Plato, I think, all throughout is not to give us the absolute answer, but to make us think. And certainly this makes us think, because it certainly, and especially now that we've got the perception, I think a lot of people have the perception that democracy is the best, but is it maybe a case of being best of the worst? And who was it? Winston Churchill, I think, said that, right? That democracy is a bad form of government, but all other forms are terrible. Or all other forms are worse. And so, and
apparently that comes from Plato.
Exactly. Well,
right here,
302b right on the screen. Which of these incorrect
Plato.
constitutions is least difficult to live with, given that they are all difficult, and which is the heaviest to bear? I think that's the question that you raised, right? And so this, a lot of the question comes about, in the second theme that I've highlighted here, this idea of the exercise of expertise versus imitation. And so when they set up, or when they defined the 6 different types of constitutions, 2 for the rule by one, 2 for rule by the few, and 2 for rule by the many, they're holding these to be imitations of the real truth. So these are not perfect, and we understand that we get into these things, or we should understand when we get into these things, that they're not perfect. And so they're imitations. And so I think if we understand that we're dealing with imitations rather than perfection, we would then be more willing to forgive each other for errors and to adjust things where required, to learn from those kind of historical precedents that Jose talked about earlier, to understand which precedents work and which don't, to make the account of the reasons why. And when we have that account of the reasons why, then we understand that, okay, this imitation wasn't the best imitation, so we'll tweak it and we'll create another imitation that's better than that imitation. But again, it's done with intelligence and with wisdom, and not by some sort of random process, not by these rulers of factions. This great quote at 303c. So then we must also remove those who participate in all of these constitutions, except for the one based on knowledge, as being not statesmen, but experts in faction. We must say that as presiding over insubstantial images, again, these imitation, on the largest scale, they are themselves of the same sort, in that as the greatest imitators and magicians, they turn out to be the greatest sophists among sophists. And maybe, as I said in the introduction, maybe we don't have to look too deeply to find these sophists, the greatest sophists among sophists now, that these, and particularly maybe technology is allowing this sort of distortion of these imitations and these sophists, who are using a lot of illogic to arise. And so maybe it is understanding this what we're dealing with is imitation. And so I've highlighted passages from 297a to 297e, in which the visitor and young Socrates again talk about the steering analogy. And I found this actually relates a lot to what actually wound up happening to old Socrates. So old Socrates was, of course, condemned by the jury in Athens for corrupting youth, and he was put to death. And so maybe that's an example of these rigid laws, these rigid constitutions that were used or were abused by people to produce an outcome that was not logical and not appropriate. And so maybe I'll just read this section here that's on the screen. So the visitor says, just as a steersman, always watching out for what is to the benefit of the ship and the sailors, preserves his fellow sailors, not by putting things down in writing, but offering his expertise as law, so too in this manner a constitution would be correct, would it not, if it issued from those who are able to rule in this way, offering the strength of their expertise as more powerful than the laws. And there is no mistake, is there, for wise rulers, whatever they do, provided that they watch for one great thing, that by always distributing to those in the city what is most just, as judged by the intelligent application of their expertise, They are able both to preserve them and so far as they can bring it about that they are better than they were. Young Socrates says it is certainly not possible to contradict what has just been said. Visitor goes on to say, well, and neither should one contradict those other things we said. Young Socrates says, what are you referring to? Visitor says that a mass of any people whatsoever would never be able to acquire this sort of expert knowledge and so govern a city with intelligence. So that's a pretty bold declaration there. And that we must look for that one constitution, the correct one, in relation to a small element in the population, few in number, or even a single individual, putting down the other constitutions as imitations, as was said a little earlier, some of them imitating this one for the better, the others for the worse. Young Socrates says, what do you mean by this? What are you saying? For I do not understand the point about imitations when it was made just now either. Visitor says, and it's no small matter if one stirs up this subject and then proceeds to leave it where it is, instead of going through it and showing the mistake that now occurs in relation to it. And this is what I said earlier. I think this is where he's saying, don't assume that I'm being anti-democratic. It's a complex thing. And so young Socrates says, what mistake is that? The visitor says, the sort of thing we must hunt for, since it is not altogether what we are used to or easy to see, but all the same, let's try to get hold of it. Tell me, given that this constitution we have talked about is, on our view, the only correct one, do you recognize that the others ought to employ the written documents that belong to this one and say themselves in this way, doing what is now praised, although it is not the most correct thing to do? Young Socrates says, what are you referring to? And the visitor says, the principle that no one in the city should dare to do anything contrary to laws, and that the person who dares to do so should be punished by death and all the worst punishments. This is very correct and fine as a second choice when one changes the principle that we discussed just now, which is our first choice. But let us go over the way in which what we have called the second best has come about. And the second best is that rigid constitution that just cannot be changed and everybody has to adhere to it. But so I'll just end that reading by saying, this is really, I think, what happened to Socrates. What the visitor says right at the end there, that the principle that no one in the city should dare do anything contrary to the laws, and that the person who dares to do so should be punished by death and all the worst punishments. Well, that's what happened to old Socrates. So the discussion here with young Socrates, I find this an interesting dramatic element in that discussion. So, are we dealing with imitations now when we bind ourselves to these things that are deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition? Are we stuck with imitations, and are we overlooking what could be the truth, which is really, ultimately, I think Plato is trying to say that government by knowledge is the best government. And the question is, how do we get knowledge in a democratic form of government, which is, maybe the ideal that we're striving for, that we want to all have some sort of power, but is that possible with knowledge? Darren, your thoughts?
I just have a quick comment and then a question. So I think it's interesting you bring out old Socrates and what happened to him, because in the Crito, we see that Socrates actually accepts the laws. Like he said he was bound to it. He doesn't try to escape his fate, even given the opportunity to escape death.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting, because I don't know, the laws, as we see in early dialogues, the laws pose this conundrum that keeps coming up. And it applies to even like in the what's the Euthyphro regarding religious practice and divine laws too. So that's just a comment. And then the question I have is so I was trying to figure this out, but then I ran out of time to resolve this. But at 303b, the stranger talks about the seventh form of government, and then he says, "For that must be set apart from all the others, as God is set apart from men." What is the seventh form? Is it like the individual ruler with knowledge? Is that the seventh form? What is the seventh form? He refers to his number, and I was like, what is the seventh one?
Yeah, the seventh one, this is after they go through the merits of these six different constitutions. And
right.
They said
what was the seventh?
So he says,
so it's like democracy, like with knowledge.
Yeah. So he says, for this reason, if all types of constitution are law-abiding, it turns out to be, and it meaning democracy, turns out to be the worst of them. But if all are contrary to law, the best. So he's saying that democracy could be best if all of the others are contrary to law. And if all are uncontrolled, living in a democracy takes the prize. But if they are ordered, life in it is least livable. And in first place, and best by far, will be life in the first, except for the seventh. For all of them, that one we must separate out from the other constitutions, like a God for men. And he's talking there about one based on knowledge. He goes further down in part C there. So then we must remove those who participate in all these constitutions, except for the one based on knowledge. So I think the seventh is the one that's based on knowledge. And
Okay.
knowledge is the challenge. We think that we know things, but we don't really know things.
Right. And so, like, I find it quite significant, though. Okay, so thanks for clarifying that, James. I mean, that's really interesting, though, that he says that from this seventh form, my translation reads, with the exception of the seventh, for that must be set apart from all the others as God is set apart from men. Like, this is sort of what I was saying before about that he's exploring these two ways of looking at a problem. Like, he's always posing this form of government as like, if we can have a ruler or rulers who have knowledge, I'm assuming both, like, you need knowledge both of the good and all the individual circumstances, so you know how to apply the good. Like, if we had someone like that, then that would be great. Like, he's always holding this as the ideal, but then he's always removing it. It's like he was tantalizing us with this image, and then he's always like pushing it at a distance. Because here he says, he even pushes it like almost an infinite distance away. He says, as God is set apart from men. Well, we're not going to be gods. We're definitely not going to be that God as he presents in the myth. But then he says, like, without knowledge, then we're all sophists. So it's like, okay, all right, we don't want to be sophists because we know his attitude towards that from the previous dialogue. So he's always drawing us to the ideal and getting us to want to achieve it. And then he's always pushing it almost a distance that we can't possibly get to.
A good observation. And, in the last episode, I mentioned the Ancient Greece Declassified podcast episode entitled Why People Hate Plato. And maybe that's a reason why people hate Plato, is that he's holding this ideal and then he's saying to us, you'll never reach that ideal. It's kind of maybe where he seems to be elitist. But then I think that's maybe a case of people not following the very complex, convoluted logic all the way through. But it's a good observation. Steve, your thoughts?
So going from what you were saying, going to your point 3, statesmanship tempered and harmonized by knowledge of time, then I would go to 306B to 307D, the last paragraph, by calling them excessive and I'm going to skip around a little bit to start with, is calling them excessive and manic, which, you could say, let's call them progressive, sharper than is timely, and appear too fast and too hard, then calling other things that are too deep and slow, conservative, cowardly, and lethargic. And then down to near the, you underlined, for I think because of their affinity to either set of qualities, they praise some things as belonging to their own kin and censor those of their opponents as alien, engaged in a great deal of hostility towards each other, among a great many things. So I think this is the point, the last sentence. While this disagreement of these classes of people is a sort of play, but in relation to the most important thing, it turns out to a disease which is the most hateful of all for all cities. So I'm just wondering what everyone thinks about that aspect that made me think.
And thank you for calling that particular part out. And there he's talking about this tension between the virtues, which we haven't got to that yet, but we've only got about 10 minutes remaining. So it's a good time to get to that. Because there are these qualities that he says are brought up, especially in family. So, one family might be led by somebody who's particularly courageous, and that courageous quality tends to transmit through the generations of that family, whereas other families might be more conservative or moderate, temperate, and that tradition will prevail through that family. And so there's this tension that arises between these two virtues. We've got the virtue of courage and the virtue of moderation. And how do you reconcile those? And so here he's making the point near the end of the dialogue that it's the ruler whose job it is not to do the particular work. Like the ruler is not the one who's administering the laws, but the ruler is the one who's administering the office holders. And the office holders are going to be, some are going to be courageous, some will be moderate, some will push the limits, others will push back. And it's the ruler's job to understand this tension between these two virtues in particular, courage and moderation, and somehow bring them into some sort of balance and harmony. I think that's the key, because again, these virtues play out over time. And if you get the people who rush out, and take actions before they fully think about them, that can have bad results. And if you get people who refuse to act when they should act, who are too moderate, then we get into other problems. So in this part, I think he's really saying that you don't want to let the city get into this disease of just being ruled by one type of virtue or the other type of virtue. Somehow there has to be a balance. So that's the way I see that particular section. So thank you for raising that. And let's see what other people think too. We'll go to JK and then Darren.
So is the republic since his ideal form of government where the rulers are philosopher kings, and with that, does that necessarily discount the inclusion of democracy within that ideal of form of government, where where the emphasis is on education perhaps, and the people who are subjects are also have been educated to understand who should be the rulers?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I wonder if there's some sort of compromise, in the sense of, if you have a philosopher ruler, that means they have trained and have a certain amount of knowledge. In the Republic, Socrates says the first order of knowledge of a philosopher is of number and calculation. So there's a certain education that the person who is going to become a ruler should have. And I don't think it's not a lot of debate, maybe just on the point that a ruler should have some knowledge, right? I think we could all agree on that. But it's a question of who's going to choose the rulers. And so, maybe there is some sort of compromise where certain people are trained for this, and then maybe the people can choose from among a number of such potential rulers. So it's not an absolute democracy in which anybody could be a ruler, because we see now what happens in that sort of case. I think there are some very bad examples of anybody's who have become rulers, but maybe it is a question of narrowing the pool of potential rulers to a number of people who could then be chosen from the people at large, but always critically must maintain within the law, or must be maintained within the law, so that these people can never get above the law and never can become the law unto themselves, and to do things just because it benefits them. I think that's the key. So I just throw that out as an idea.
But even the people who are choosing the rulers should have some basic understanding of what's going on, right? So they need some basic levels of education about government and character and so forth to be able to make those choices.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the tension, with the right to vote, maybe comes a responsibility to understand some of the basic things, some of the civic rules. I don't know if civics are taught in school anymore. I think we got a little bit when I was going through school many, many moons ago, but whether that's taught anymore, I don't know to what extent. But yeah, certainly a vote cast without any sort of knowledge, just as a random vote, or because you like somebody's name, or you like somebody's skin color or whatever, to me, that's not democracy. That's just an exercise, and that's almost tyranny in a way. It's rule without any sort of basis in reason. So definitely reason, I would say, has to come into play. Very good question. I mean, we could have an episode on that alone, that question. So thank you. Darren.
So I want to make a comment on the clash of virtues, or a couple of comments. I think where this idea was first introduced, I think the dialogue does say that it might apply to other virtues too, like how the virtues in general tend to or can clash. Though I think the thesis actually is stronger than can here. The thesis is that they do clash, which is one of the reasons why the statesman seems to be required to step up here. So I think that's interesting idea in general about the virtues in general. And then I think I think there's a lot of interesting echoes of today, even like this is so relevant. There's stuff here that describes a kind of like social polarization about how, the groups just sort of mingle with each other, and then they even breed with each other, and then they form families with each other. So then they just become more like their type. Like these are almost like personality types, I find. And this is actually a thing that's been studied, that this kind of polarization exists at least in the US a lot more than Canada, where like geographically people are like moving into, like, Republicans are living in Republican areas, and increasingly they're segregated. They live in different communities from like Democrats, and people are sorting themselves in this way. And so I just find it interesting how like there's just so many echoes in this whole section, the whole stretch of text, what's happening or what that continues to happen in politics up to this day. And what I find significant about the characterization of the statesman here, the statesman is almost like managing all these he's like, Plato's almost describing different forces in the state here. The courageous is described as, the unrestrained forces, and then the moderate or the self-restrained forces, and how, Plato sees both these forces as necessary, because if you have too much self-restraint in people, or, if you have too little, they both end up on a sort of train to slavery, he says, which is pretty extreme thing to say, but that's what he says. So it's interesting that Plato sort of looks up to both forces, but also sees both forces as dangerous if you have too much of it. And how the way they're reconciled is not within the individuals. Like he could have easily proposed that, but he says it's not. It's like these different characters, they sort of mix with each other. I mean, amongst themselves, they mix with each other amongst themselves. He describes these great tensions between these types of people. So what the statesman does is he manages forces, like social forces and human forces. So I don't know. I find that it's like a kind of interesting kind of knowledge. I don't know like what the word is, but it's like he's managing human motivations, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good observation. It's almost like the ideal ruler is some sort of psychologist who understands human behavior, and is able to work with that, and doesn't necessarily judge people as being right or wrong, doesn't condemn people, but manages, with what's there and available. And it brings it back to that analogy of weaving that we started with in the Statesman, and has been used many other times in Plato's dialogues. This weaving of a fabric, intertwining of differing factions and factors, and working it all in so that there's some sort of harmony in this mix. It's never going to be perfect, but there has to be harmony. I think that's the key. And so I like the way that you raise that, because it really leads into the conclusion of the Statesman, which is this section from 310D to 311A. And given that we are almost out of time, I thought maybe I would just end today's session by reading this, because I think this brings us to an understanding of what this ideal state and its ruler is. And so I've got it up here on the screen. So this is a visitor talking. It is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature, it comes to a peak of power at first, but in the end it bursts out completely in fits of madness. And in its turn, the soul that is too full of reserve and has no admixture of courageous initiative and is reproduced over many generations in this way, by nature grows more sluggish, then is timely, and then in the end is completely crippled. It was these bonds that I meant when I said that there was no difficulty at all in tying them together once the situation existed in which both types had a single opinion about what was fine and good. For this is the single and complete task of kingly weaving together, never to allow moderate dispositions to stand away from the courageous, rather by working them closely into each other as if with a shuttle. That's a part of the weaving process. Through sharing of opinions, through honors, dishonor, esteem, and the giving of pledges to one another, it draws together a smooth and fine woven fabric out of them, as the expression is, and always entrusts offices and cities to these in common. By choosing the person who has both qualities to put in charge wherever there turns out to be a need for a single officer, and by mixing together a part of each of these groups where there is a need for more than one. For the dispositions of moderate people when in office are markedly cautious, just, and conservative, but they lack bite and a certain sharp and practical keenness. And the dispositions of the courageous, in their turn, are inferior to the others in relation to justice and caution, but have an exceptional degree of keenness when it comes to action. Everything in cities cannot go well, either on the private or on the public level, unless both of these groups are there to give their help. So again, this intertwining of these different natures of people. And then he concludes in the last paragraph, then let us say that this marks the completion of the fabric, which is the product of the art of statesmanship, the weaving together with regular intertwining of the dispositions of brave and moderate people, when the expertise belonging to the king brings their life together in agreement and friendship and makes it common between them, completing the most significant and best of all fabrics and covering it with it all the other inhabitants of cities, both slave and free, and holds them together with this twining and rules and directs without, so far as it belongs to a city to be happy, falling short of that in any respect. And so that's the conclusion. So there is in the end no perfection, but there is an individual who is ruling with knowledge, with intelligence, and not arbitrarily, who is bringing these different dispositions together and finding the common ground. And that takes knowledge. It takes an understanding of people and their motivations, and it takes an understanding of time and the effects of time and the causes and effects that led to things as they are now. In other words, the account of the reasons why, and then understanding what you're going to do with that account of the reasons why, which is, as Plato said in the Meno, knowledge, the account of the reasons why. So I wanted to thank everybody we've had a great discussion, these 3 sessions on the Statesman and preceded by 3 sessions on the Sophist. I think there's this incredible logic that I'm sensing that has all come together, from the 6 sessions in total, that and some very important points that people have raised. And again, I'm going to listen to this recording as well as the others again, because I think there's so much to be picked up, and so much nuance to be picked up on reviewing and revisiting these ideas. They cannot just be left, they have to be continually built on and worked on. And to understand, I think, as you said, Darren, this incredible relevance to today. I think we're reading, especially in today's section at the end of the Statesman, I think there are so many points that are very relevant to our modern world, our modern technological world, 2,400 years after Plato wrote these points. And so I think they are incredibly important. And I think there needs to be a very broad discussion about this. And we need to set aside biases, but the meanings of words and how things came to be, and just understand how we go forward. And JK, you asked that excellent question of how we choose the right leader. And that's a question that's very much unresolved today, but a very important question, given the power, the technological power that we have in this world that could destroy us if the wrong leader gets their hands on the levers of that power. So very relevant. And so thank you all for such a great discussion. And I look forward to our next session, which we will move to Parmenides. I've been trying to think about how we can cover all of Parmenides in 3 sessions or less, and I've come to the conclusion that we can't. So I think we'll do Parmenides in 2 sessions, and I'll do it in maybe a little bit of a different way, where I'll present, I think, what are some of the key logical sections. And maybe we can start discussing those this season and then pick up again next season. So we'll take a break after the end of June. We'll end season 2 at the end of June, and then come back in September for season 3. And we can pick up again on Parmenides in season 3. But I'd like to introduce Parmenides in season 2, because there's some very important pieces of logic that I think tie particularly well to the Sophist and the Statesman. And so maybe it's a natural kind of next step for us to look at. So next session, we'll look at Parmenides, and we'll start by looking at Parmenides to 141a, which is when they start talking about the effects of time. So I focused on time in this episode, and I think we'll see the setup in Parmenides to that point, 141a, where they start talking about time in particular. So that'll be for the next session in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, I thank everybody for participating. Hope to see you in 2 weeks. And anybody who wishes to stay online now, I'll end the recording, and we can stay online for a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general.